Pam Bondi was no stranger to pressure, having spent years tackling some of the toughest legal battles in the country, but as she stepped into Judge Howard Gates' courtroom, she could tell this day would be different. Known for his sharp tongue and unpredictable rulings, Gates barely acknowledged her as she approached, flipping through a file with exaggerated slowness, letting an unsettling silence fill the room. The case was a high-stakes government ethics violation involving a wealthy developer accused of misusing state funds for personal projects. Evidence was stacked high, and Bondi was ready. What she wasn't ready for was the judge's open hostility. Without even glancing up, he finally spoke, his voice dripping with condescension. "Miss Bondi, I assume you've prepared something of substance today, or should we just skip ahead to the part where you waste my time?" A few chuckles echoed from the back of the courtroom, but what happened next left everyone stunned. Minutes later, the same judge who had just insulted her was in handcuffs, a shocking turn of events no one saw coming. Mostly, the chuckles came from the defendant's legal team, but Pam Bondi ignored them. She had faced far worse. "Your Honor, I believe the evidence will speak for itself. This case involves the misuse of taxpayer dollars, and my job is to ensure the facts are presented accurately," she stated firmly. Judge Gates leaned back in his chair, feigning boredom. "Taxpayer dollars, right, because that's never been the foundation of a frivolous case before," he scoffed. Bondi's jaw tightened, but she kept her tone even. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I would hardly call felony corruption charges frivolous." For a moment, their eyes locked, his cold and calculating, hers unwavering. But before she could continue, he cut her off again. "Ms. Bondi, spare me the lectures. Just get to the point. I don't have all day to entertain whatever grandstanding you have planned." A murmur spread through the gallery. The courtroom wasn't packed, but those present were alert, sensing something was off. Judges could be tough, but this was personal. Bondi took a slow breath, recalibrating. She knew exactly what was happening. Gates wanted to throw her off balance, to control the tempo, to put her on the defensive. But she wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. Instead, she picked up a folder from the table, flipping it open. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit. These financial records clearly demonstrate," Bondi began, but Judge Gates cut her off. "Do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork, or is this just your way of compensating?" The shift in the room was instant. The defense attorney smirked, a few reporters exchanged glances, but Bondi didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that men like Gates thrived on intimidation, and the only way to beat them was to never let them see you rattle. She paused just long enough to make a statement without saying a word, then calmly set the folder down and clasped her hands together. "Your Honor, if you prefer to continue making this personal, I'm happy to request a recess while we address any professional concerns you may have." It was subtle, not aggressive, not disrespectful, but pointed. A clear warning that she wasn't going to roll over. Judge Gates' lips curled slightly. Was that amusement or annoyance? It was hard to tell, but he wasn't done. "Oh, I don't have concerns, Ms. Bondi. I just know a weak case when I see one." This time, the reaction wasn't just murmurs, there were gasps. Someone whispered under their breath. This wasn't how a judge was supposed to conduct a hearing. Pam could feel the weight of the room shifting, eyes bouncing between her and Gates like a tennis match. But she wasn't going to engage in a shouting match. That's exactly what he wanted. Instead, Pam Bondi adjusted her blazer, straightened a few papers, and looked Judge Gates dead in the eye. "Then I suppose we should let the evidence do the talking." But as she spoke, she caught something in his expression, not just arrogance, not just condescension. There was something else, a flicker of something deeper, like a man who had a personal stake in the outcome of this case. And that's when she knew, this wasn't just about courtroom theatrics. Judge Gates wasn't being combative for sport, he had something to hide. What he didn't know was that so did she. Bondi had been in plenty of tense hearings before, but this was different. Gates wasn't just ruling from the bench, he was playing a game, a calculated and deliberate attempt to undermine her in front of the entire courtroom. But why? She could feel the weight of his stare as she moved through her arguments, every word she spoke like bait he was waiting to pounce on. She could practically see it, the slight curl of his lips, the slow tap of his fingers on the bench, as if daring her to keep going. But she wasn't about to stop. Your Honor, she continued, her tone steady, these documents show a clear discrepancy in the funding allocations. The defendant's company received nearly triple the amount approved in the original budget, and none of it was accounted for in the state records. Pam Bondi turned slightly, gesturing toward the projection screen where the financial statements were displayed. Now, if you look here, Miss Bondi, Judge Gates interrupted, his voice laced with smugness. I hate to interrupt your presentation, really, I do, but I think we've seen enough numbers for one day. Bondi glanced at him, then back at the screen. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Your Honor, with all due respect, these numbers are the foundation of the case. Right, he scoffed. And yet, I fail to see anything that justifies wasting the court's time like this. There it was again, wasting time. He was trying to bury this case before it even had a chance. Behind her, she heard the soft rustle of the prosecution team shifting in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. They felt it too, something wasn't right. Tightening her grip on her pen, she flipped to the next page in her file. Your Honor, I'd like to submit a motion to, denied. Silence. Bondi looked up. I haven't even stated the motion yet. And yet I can already tell you it's going nowhere, Gates said, leaning forward, elbows resting on the bench. Let's be honest, Miss Bondi, this entire case is built on speculation. A little creative accounting, and suddenly you're crying corruption. The defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a navy suit, smirked. He hadn't needed to say a word. Gates was doing all the work for him. Bondi exhaled slowly, her patience razor-thin. Your Honor, are you refusing to allow my motion before hearing it? Its contents, a pause, a beat too long, then, I'm refusing to indulge this circus act any longer. The courtroom wasn't just tense now, it was shifting. Eyes darted, heads turned, even the reporters in the back were scribbling faster. Bondi caught the glance of a juror, a woman in her 50s wearing a dark blazer, her brows furrowed, lips pressed together. She wasn't the only one taking notice. The problem with arrogance? It makes people pay attention. Bondi squared her shoulders. Very well, Your Honor. Then let's proceed with the next piece of evidence. She turned back to the screen, clicking to the next slide. This document, obtained through a subpoena, shows that, Ms. Bondi. The tone was different this time. A shift. She stopped, looked at him. Judge Gates was no longer leaning back, no longer wearing that smug expression. His hands were clasped now, his mouth a thin, hard line. Something had changed. Approach the bench. It wasn't a request. She hesitated, then set her papers down and walked toward him. The courtroom hushed. When she reached the bench, he lowered his voice just enough so only she could hear. I'd strongly suggest you reconsider the direction you're taking here, Ms. Bondi. She tilted her head slightly. Excuse me? I'm saying, he murmured, that some fights aren't worth having. She let that sit in the air between them, then slowly, deliberately, leaned in just an inch closer. I don't scare easily, Judge Gates. A muscle in his jaw twitched. She turned and walked back to her table, but that moment told her everything she needed to know. Pam Bondi returned to her seat. Her mind was racing. That wasn't just a power move, it was a warning, a veiled threat disguised as judicial authority. But why? She had walked into this courtroom expecting pushback, maybe even hostility, but this was something deeper. Judge Gates wasn't just biased, he was protecting something, or someone. Keeping her expression neutral, she adjusted a stack of papers while the prosecution team beside her shifted, waiting for her to react. She didn't. Not yet. Instead, she lifted her chin and faced the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to continue presenting my evidence. Gates didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, as if deciding how far he wanted to push. Then finally, he spoke. Proceed, but keep it brief. Bondi didn't acknowledge the jab. She simply reached for the next file. This document is a contract signed between the defendant and the city's planning board outlining the proposed project expenses. You'll notice that the listed costs total just over $2 million. She paused, then, with deliberate precision, placed another sheet on the projector. However, this is an internal ledger from the defendant's company showing that the actual funds transferred were nearly double that amount. And here, she placed a third document down. This, she said, her voice steady, is the approval signature, signed off by, she hesitated, letting the weight of the moment settle, Judge Howard Gates. The courtroom didn't just shift, it cracked. A ripple of movement spread through the room, eyes darting, pens scratching frantically. The defense attorney stiffened, his smug expression wiped clean. Judge Gates, he didn't move. For the first time since she had stepped into this courtroom, his face was unreadable. Bondi let the silence hang a moment longer, then continued. Your Honor, would you like to explain why your signature appears on an unauthorized financial transaction involving the defendant? A calculated risk. She didn't have the full story yet, but she had enough to shake the foundation beneath him. Gates finally shifted, his fingers pressing together, knuckles whitening. That document, he said slowly, is inadmissible. Bondi tilted her head. How so? It was obtained improperly. She let that sink in. Your Honor, this document was subpoenaed by my office. His nostrils flared. Then it was mishandled. I'm ruling it inadmissible. It will not be considered by this court. This time, the shift wasn't just in the gallery, it was everywhere. The jury, the stenographer, even the bailiff. Everyone was watching. Bondi crossed her arms, her tone calm. You do realize this is a public hearing, correct? That the media is here? That every single person in this room just saw you declare critical financial evidence inadmissible without reason? A muscle in his jaw jumped. That's enough. Miss Bondi. She didn't move. Didn't blink. Then, slowly, she sat down, and that's when she did something that changed everything. Reaching into her case, she pulled out a small recorder, placed it on the table, and pressed play. A voice filled the courtroom, low, gruff, unmistakable. Take care of it. I don't care how. The recording crackled, then continued. Make sure she doesn't get her hands on those ledgers. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Judge Gates didn't move. Didn't breathe. Bondi didn't look at him, she didn't need to. Because now, every single person in this room had heard him, and the real game was about to begin. The recording ended, leaving nothing but a stunned, collective realization hanging in the air. Judge Howard Gates had just been caught. Pam Bondi didn't move, her eyes fixed on the recorder as if daring him to challenge what had just played. But he didn't. He couldn't. Across the courtroom, the defense attorney finally blinked, his composure slipping, the smirk wiped clean and replaced with something closer to dread. He glanced at his client, the wealthy developer whose empire had been built on backroom deals and political favors. The man looked pale. Judge Gates cleared his throat. Ms. Bondi, I don't know where you obtained that recording, but that's not the question you should be asking, Your Honor, she interrupted, her voice unwavering. The real question is, who are you talking to? His fingers curled into fists. This is outrageous, he snapped. This entire hearing is descending into chaos because of your grandstanding. Chaos? Bondi repeated, her tone light, almost amused. I'd call this clarity, finally, some transparency in this courtroom. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. She let the moment breathe, let Gates sweat, then slid a document across the table. Your Honor, this is a transcript of a wiretap, legally obtained during our investigation. She tapped the top of the page. It corroborates everything you just heard on that recording. Judge Gates stared at the document but didn't touch it, his chest rising and falling, his breathing suddenly louder. Bondi turned slightly toward the bailiff. Officer Reynolds, would you kindly read the highlighted section aloud? The bailiff hesitated, then picked up the transcript, his voice steady but weighted with the gravity of the words. "We'll take care of her. Bondi doesn't have anything solid yet, but if she does, I'll make sure it never sees the inside of a courtroom." A sharp inhale came from someone in the gallery. Bondi folded her hands together. "I'd like to submit this as evidence, Your Honor." Judge Gates's eyes flickered toward the exit, just a tiny movement, but enough to signal that, for the first time, he wasn't thinking about his own arrogance. He was thinking about escape. But it was far too late for that. "Motion denied," he barked. Bondi raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "This hearing is over," Gates snapped, his voice a fraction too loud. "I will not allow, Judge Gates," Bondi said smoothly, cutting him off. "I wasn't asking for your permission." And then she did it, the move she'd been waiting for. She turned toward the back of the courtroom and gave the smallest, subtlest nod. A door opened. Footsteps echoed against the polished floor. Then, a firm, authoritative voice announced, "Judge Howard Gates, you are under arrest." Gasps erupted from every corner of the room. Reporters fumbled for their phones, cameras clicked, the jury gaped, and even the defendant, the powerful man who had expected this trial to be nothing more than a formality, looked genuinely stunned. Judge Gates didn't turn, didn't speak. He just sat there, eyes fixed on a single point on his bench, as if staying still could somehow make everything disappear. But reality had already caught up with him. Pam Bondi remained seated as two uniformed officers flanked the judge. One reached into his pocket, the other pulled out a set of cuffs. "This is absurd," Gates muttered, but the fight had already drained from his voice. The officer didn't blink. "You have the right to remain silent." And for the first time in his career, Judge Howard Gates actually was. The sound of metal clicking shut was deafening, the cuffs locking around his wrists, sealing his fate in front of the very people he had spent years ruling over. The once commanding figure behind the bench now sat frozen, his expression a mask of disbelief. Stunned murmurs rippled through the room, disbelief crackling through the air like electricity. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their hands moving furiously across their notepads. Even the jury, bound by their duty to remain impartial, couldn't hide their shock. Pam Bondi stayed seated, her face unreadable. This wasn't about gloating. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. Judge Gates finally found his voice. "You can't do this," he whispered, as if even he didn't believe his own words. The officer holding his arm didn't flinch. "Sir, you are being taken into custody for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power. You'll have your chance to speak with an attorney." Gates yanked against the cuffs, his face flushing. "This is a disgrace. I am the law in this courtroom." Bondi finally stood, straightening her blazer. "Not anymore." His head snapped toward her, and for the first time, the arrogance was gone, replaced by something closer to fear. The officers pulled him to his feet, but he resisted. "This is political." This, Bondi cut in, shaking her head, "is accountability." The room went dead silent again. A lifetime of unchecked power, gone in an instant. Gates's face twisted, his jaw clenching as he turned to the gallery, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for an ally, someone who would stand up and declare this a mistake. But no one moved. Because it wasn't a mistake. A few feet away, the defense attorney had gone ghost white. The developer, the man who had thought his influence could shield him, wasn't faring much better, his fingers gripped the edge of the table, his breathing shallow. Bondi let her eyes linger on him for just a second before turning back to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm, measured, "if you have anything to say, I'd suggest you save it for your arraignment." Gates' mouth opened, then shut, because there was nothing left to say. The officers moved to escort him toward the side exit, but before they could reach the door, the developer finally found his voice. "Wait." His chair scraped against the floor as he shot up, eyes darting between Gates and Bondi. "This is getting out of hand, we can work something out." Bondi arched an eyebrow. "Work something out?" Lawson swallowed, visibly unraveling. I mean, there's no need for this kind of public spectacle. Let's be reasonable. Bondi steadied him, then stepped forward. You seem nervous, Mr. Lawson. His mouth opened, but no words came. She tilted her head. Why would that be? He forced a laugh, shaking his head. Nervous? No, this is insane. You don't seriously believe Gates is guilty, do you? Bondi let the question hang. Then, simply, do you? Silence. The officers resumed their march, leading Gates through the door. When it shut behind him, the weight of the moment settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was the unraveling of a system that had been protected for far too long. And Bondi wasn't done yet. She glanced at the jury, then at the judge's empty seat, and finally at the defense table. I believe we still have a trial to finish. But after what had just happened, everyone in that room knew this was only the beginning. The air felt different now, lighter, as if years of corruption had just been lifted in an instant. Judge Gates was gone, hauled out in cuffs, and the shock of it still lingered like the final note of a symphony. Bondi took her seat again, adjusting the papers in front of her. The trial wasn't over, not yet, but the biggest obstacle had just been removed. She turned her attention to the defense table. Charles Lawson had gone eerily quiet, his usual smugness replaced by something colder, more calculating. He was still trying to assess the damage, still trying to figure out how much of his safety net had just been ripped away. Bondi could see the wheels turning in his head. Without Gates on the bench, his legal team would have to argue the case on its own merits. And they had none. She leaned forward slightly.